The United States and the Soviet Union only entered the war because they were victims of devastating surprise attacks. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union with more than 3 million troops. The Soviet military was utterly unprepared, and the losses were disastrous. On the first day alone, the German Luftwaffe destroyed over 2,000 aircraft. Hermann Goering, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, did not believe these reports, but they actually may have been even higher. A Soviet archival document admitted a loss of 3,922 aircraft just in the first 3 days alone, against just 78 German losses. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched Operation AI, the attack on Pearl Harbor, with 353 planes from 6 aircraft carriers. U.S. forces were caught completely by surprise and suffered heavy damage to its battle fleet. 2 battleships were permanently sunk, 3 others heavily damaged, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground, all for the loss of just 29 Japanese planes. What is unsettling is that both nations showed colossal incompetence in being victims of a surprise attack. Both had excellent intelligence on an obvious military threat and were caught unawares. The Soviet Union was warned by British intelligence, German deserters, the New York Times, and their own spies that an attack was imminent. The Japanese were extremely lucky to have achieved surprise at Pearl Harbor. The United States was able to read Japan's secret codes, spotted and sank a Japanese sub operating just outside Pearl, and detected the incoming attacking planes on radar. Some people do love their conspiracy theories, but the more mundane reality is that surprise attacks are very hard to recognize in real time. All it takes is one incompetent in a bureaucracy for vital information to be ignored. This isn't surprising because bureaucracies are notoriously inflexible as they reward mediocrities and are staffed with people that lack initiative. It is interesting to compare the respective governments' public addresses. Joseph Stalin did not address the attack. Rather, the news was delivered via radio by Foreign Minister via Czeslaw Molotov. This attack is unheard of and is a treacherous act that has no equal in the history of civilized peoples. The attack on our country was launched despite the fact that a non-aggression treaty between the USSR and Germany has been signed and that the Soviet Union has observed all conditions of this treaty in full honesty. The government of the Soviet Union is firmly convinced that the entire population of our nation, all workers, farmers, and the intelligentsia, men and women, shall meet their obligations and devote themselves to their work with the necessary conviction. Each of us must demand discipline, order, and self-sacrifice from themselves and others, worthy of a real Soviet patriot in order to guarantee victory over the enemy. Our cause is just. The enemy shall be defeated. Victory shall be ours. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation in his famous Day of Infamy speech.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Both speeches emphasized a dastardly attack against a peaceful nation. Both stated the attackers had deliberately used false promises of negotiation. Both leaders urged their citizens to sacrifice in what were going to be difficult times. Both emphasized their righteousness. Both assured victory was certain because their cause was just. Washington and Moscow had very different governments. However, their appeals for their citizens to take up arms had a lot of parallels. Both suffered embarrassing defeats in their first encounter against the German Wehrmacht. The summer of 1941 was one of constant losses and retreats for the Soviet Red Army. Perhaps the most significant of these was the Battle of Kiev, in which the Germans destroyed the entire southwestern front and inflicted over 700,000 casualties, while only losing 1/10 of that amount. The first time the U.S. Army fought the Germans was in February 1943 at a series of engagements known as the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Despite possessing numerical superiority, inexperienced and poorly led U.S. troops suffered many more casualties and were pushed back over 50 miles. As military historian John Shai concluded, the Kasserine defeat is a classic study of how not to conduct a battle. Both became highly skilled in armor and maneuver warfare that is often associated with the German Blitzkrieg. U.S. General George S. Patton's Third Army, from the time it was activated in August 1944 until the end of the war, inflicted about 1.5 million German casualties while suffering only 150,000 casualties itself. The Third Army had consistently outperformed its Wehrmacht adversary, the latter suffering nearly twice as many dead, even though the Third Army was almost always attacking. It should be noted that according to historian Charles B. MacDonald, for the entire Western Front in World War II, German and Allied casualties were actually roughly equal. Patton was by far the best U.S. general, and it's not even close. Every year it engaged against the German Wehrmacht, the Soviet Red Army won the most important battle: Moscow in 1941, Stalingrad in 1942, Kursk in 1943, Bagration in 1944, Berlin in 1945. I'd assert that the Soviet High Command, Stavka, had after 1941 the best army strategist in the war. The Soviet victory at Bagration is particularly noteworthy as it had destroyed an entire army group and was so thorough that 31 of the 47 German commanders were either killed or captured. Of the 5.7 million Soviet POWs taken by the Germans, 3.3 million, about 58%, died in captivity. 93,941 Americans were taken prisoner, from which 1,121 died, about 1.2%. Both forcibly interned or relocated citizens of ethnic minorities that were incorrectly perceived to be a domestic threat. Both also had languages in their constitutions that proclaimed all people were equal. As Cicero once said, laws are silent in time of war. Both were far better at mobilizing resources and its citizenry than Germany, leading to production figures that dwarfed the Third Reich. This is especially noteworthy in the Soviet case since Germany had a higher GDP, produced more steel, and possessed a more skilled labor force. But this came as a terrible price to the Soviet Union, while in contrast proved to be a boon for the United States. During the 1930s, the United States was deeply mired in the Great Depression, whereas the Soviet Union experienced explosive growth in its industrial sector. During this time, the saying, "I have seen the future and it works," which referenced the Soviet Union, resonated with many Americans. By 1945, at war's end, the Soviet Union was experiencing cases of famine and its GDP dropped below pre-war levels. By contrast, the GDP in the United States had risen by 70% and the average American's wealth had doubled. During the war, the Soviet government had to evacuate millions of people and entire industries to the east in order to prevent them from being overrun by German armies. Moscow forcibly mobilized its citizens into either the army or as workers, which sent them here, there, and everywhere. This included women. Those with children above the age of 4 were mobilized just like men. As historian Wendy Z. Goldman has quipped, no one on May 9, 1945, Victory Day, woke up in the same bed that they went to sleep on June 22, 1941, on the day of the invasion. Many Soviet factories were so quickly reassembled they did not have roofs, and almost all of them lacked heat. Laborers worked 11 to 16-hour shifts literally under open skies in the Siberian winter. There was no longer a family kitchen. They ate in canteens, and the state had built roughshod barracks that had no sanitation. There was literally no soap, so no way for the workers covered in coolants and oils to clean themselves. There were zero consumer goods. Everything was devoted to the war. This included food. The entire Soviet citizenry had to be provisioned for food because there was none for sale. And there was never enough. Hunger was the dominant factor in everybody's lives. Those factory workers, even though they received the highest allotted share, ate 500 fewer calories a day than their British counterparts and 1,000 fewer than American workers. Starvation and regional famines were constant features in the Soviet Union during the war. So many people were sickened or died that for the first time, doctors began to understand starvation as a disease divided in separate stages. Things were so bad that in 1942, 1 out of every 3 babies died before their first year, a rate that is literally worse than pre-industrial societies that lack health care or knowledge of germ theory. Things only eased by 1944 with a large influx of Lend-Lease from the United States. This was, of course, in territory controlled by the Soviet government. In those areas overrun by Nazi invaders, millions were shot, starved, hung, raped, or deported for slave labor, and many villages were literally burned to the ground. The Nazi regime had waged a Vernichtungskrieg, or a war of annihilation, on the Eastern Front. According to a Russian Academy of Science estimate, about 13.7 million Soviet civilians were killed during the war. Some historians believe this number is higher. I feel it would be accurate to state there was no home front in the Soviet Union, as deprivations and death were ever-present features. During the war, the United States government did not forcibly mobilize its population or even control its production. Government contracts were bid on by established firms or by industries that were started by entrepreneurs. About 40 million Americans did move, but voluntarily. mostly to cities in the South and the West, to work in these newfound opportunities. Whereas in the Soviet Union, rationing literally meant receiving life-sustaining food, in the United States, rationing meant restrictions. Women could only buy one silk stockings, for example. Despite the rationing, American standard of living improved during World War II. In 1945, labor wages had risen by 70%, and Americans ate more meat, bought more shoes, and used more electricity than they did in 1939. Take supermarkets, which are a convenient measure for prosperity, consumer confidence, and product availability. In 1939, there were 4,900 supermarkets in the United States. By 1944, there were 16,000, an increase of over threefold. The United States was such an economic juggernaut that it became known as the Arsenal Democracy, a phrase coined by GM President Bill Knudsen, by the way, not FDR. To give one example, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, operated by Chrysler, was built from nothing just during the winter of 1940. This single plant went on to produce 22,234 tanks, more than the entire German nation did, even though it began rearming in 1936. All of this was done despite the fact that when Chrysler's president, K.T. Keller, was asked if his company could build a tank, he replied, "Yes. What's a tank look like?" In total, the United States produced about 50% of all war production during World War II. Although the war was a boon for the United States and Americans, it was still a total war, and sacrifices were made. American workers in war-related industries during 1942 to 1943 died or were injured in numbers 20 times greater than American servicemen killed or wounded during those same years. At GM, 189 senior executives died on the job. This from a nation with the best fed, best paid, and least rationed workforce. Exhaustion, accidents, stress-induced pressures, and on-the-job training turned already dangerous work physically and psychologically deadly. Considering the Soviet conditions, one can only imagine their losses. The United States suffered about 420,000 dead during the war from a population of 131 million. That's about 0.32%. The overwhelming majority were military losses. According to the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Soviet Union lost 26.6 million people. That's 26.6 million people, about 14% of the total population. Most of the German Wehrmacht was stationed on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. After the D-Day landings, there were 135 Army divisions in the East versus 70 in the West. Thus, it's not surprising that most of Germany's military losses occurred on the Eastern Front. German military casualties are heavily disputed by historians, but let's just take median values for comparison's sake. Of the 4.3 million German military deaths, 3.5 million of those occurred on the Eastern Front, about 80%. Some final contrast between the Soviet Union and the United States. The distance between Moscow and Berlin is about the same as from Boston to Atlanta. In this area, what historian Timothy Snyder calls the Bloodlands, about 27 million Soviet citizens died winning what they called the Great Patriotic War. 0 people were killed by military action in the land between Boston and Atlanta. To get a sense of how much of a demographic disaster the Second World War was to the Soviet Union, we can see in Russia's population pyramid what happened to the age cohort that fought the Second World War. The number of widows and women who would never marry, the millions of people who were never born, and how these losses reverberate every generation. The ghosts of World War II haunt Russia, and this is true of all Eastern Europe, literally to this day. This most recent pyramid shows the Second World War is not just a bad memory in the Bloodlands. They are beginning another generational cycle that amounts to a black hole of missing people. For comparison, this is the population pyramid of the United States. Relatively normal, though it looks like the baby boomer generation is aptly named, with little bulges for them and their offspring. Leningrad was to the Soviet Union what Chicago was to the United States. Leningrad suffered under siege for 872 days. Is it possible for us to mentally picture thousands of dead bodies lying on the frozen streets between Lakeshore Drive and Evanston? Or that 750,000 Chicagoans would die? Or begin to fathom that some of them would engage in cannibalism, as Russian archival documents show? What Chicago did do was produce the second most related war goods of all U.S. cities, Detroit being number one. Aside from trivial damage from a couple of Japanese subs, not a single building of consequence in the continental United States was damaged or destroyed by enemy military action. Cities in the USA boomed. Washington, D.C. turned from a southern town into a northern metropolis, almost doubling its population during the war. Meanwhile, Soviet cities such as Smolensk, Kharkov, Minsk, Kiev, Stalingrad, and Rostov were in ruins after the war. For every one American killed during the Second World War, 63 Soviet citizens died due to the war. At war's end in 1945, a poll in France showed that 57% of the respondents believed the Soviet Union contributed most to the defeat of Germany. Asked 60 years later in 2004, only 20% respondents in France felt the Soviet Union had contributed most, as compared to 58% for the United States. Note, France has had strained relations and opinion of the United States since World War II. This is not a biased poll. Scholars of memory have noted that both Americans and Russians overwhelmingly believe that their nation was most responsible for the Allied victory in World War II, while heavily downplaying the other. Both have allowed Cold War propaganda and the inherent native bias to forget what both knew to be true during the Second World War. Neither could defeat Nazi Germany on their own without the other. They made almost perfect allies, complementing each other's weaknesses and augmenting their strengths. The United States originally planned to field 200 divisions, but it's extremely difficult to do that over 3,000 miles of ocean. The USSR had a robust industrial base, but has historically struggled to produce quality consumer goods and sophisticated high-tech material, such as high-octane aviation gasoline and precise machine tools. The partnership allowed these two nations to concentrate on what they did best. The USSR mobilized a huge army, so the US only had to field 90 divisions, while the United States provided the Red Army with hundreds of thousands of vehicles and enough telephone cable to wrap around the Earth 35 times, which made it a much more potent force. It just goes to show Walt Whitman was correct when he wrote, "The real war will never get in the books."